We stand on the edge of profound change. To meet the demands of a green transition, we need collective wisdom, diverse voices, and bold ideas. Collaboration is the key to unlocking our sustainable future. Together, we can overcome the challenges ahead and seize the opportunities that will define the green economy.
So in advance of this conversation, a little thought went through my mind back to South Africa in 1994, which was when you have and I maintain that that was the best government South Africa has ever had, the Mandela administration, is when you have a change of government and the people in that government are genuinely committed to something, they tend to appoint truly excellent people to really important positions. And if you look at your resume and what you've done, it really is, I think, a remarkable thing that you are doing what you're doing, because you have not come at this as a novice, and you've been doing it for decades, and you are unusually well positioned. So I'm incredibly excited by this conversation. And therefore, I'd like to kick off by asking, we're on the eve of COP. You, in some ways, are the UK government's sort of leading voice there to try and achieve what the UK government, but also I think the broader movement of trying to produce a more sustainable world would want. And so I'd like you to just start by saying, if you closed your eyes and envisaged a perfect COP with optimal outcomes, what would it look like when it's all done and dusted in a week or two's time?
Thank you very much. And it's really lovely to be here. Thanks for turning out. Well, no COP can be seen in isolation. I think that's part of the issue, right? That there's this sort of push and pull. You know, we get ourselves worked up. We everybody sort of pushes towards a COP, and then we have this forcing mechanism, and it pulls us forward, and then we project ourselves forwards with a slingshot to the next COP. So the world, controversially, right, but nevertheless, agreed to some pretty big things a year ago. And in a year's time, every country will have said what its ambition level is. Hopefully those nationally determined contributions, their ambition levels are investable. And so this COP has a very important role to play in bridging between, a commitment to trebling renewables and doubling efficiency, or the other way around, and some of the financial agreements or financial mechanisms that were promised, and the ambition that government has. And of course, that golden thread all the way through is around finance. So I think ideally you would see at COP countries agreeing on some of the stuff that they've kicked the can along the road on, which is Article 6, carbon markets. And of course the big issue is this what we call the collective quantifiable goal. But there is another story around COPs, right, which is, and I think this is very difficult to communicate to the general public, which is about keeping the show on the road. So multilateralism is difficult. Multilateralism is being picked at from all sides. And whatever the issue, whether it's arms control or climate or vaccines or making sure we manage pandemics differently, the multilateralism is complicated. And so you do have to go at it once and then go at it again. And we saw the negotiations in Cali on biodiversity, where we saw some things agreed, but some things not agreed, So it's a cup half full, cup half empty. And that's difficult to convey when you are in an urgent crisis, right? But so part of it is to keep the process going, keep people in the process, keep people moving forward, lay the groundwork, hold people to account, hold institutions outside of the UN to account, and make the progress that is necessary, because all the hopes and expectations are that in Brazil, we can sort of take a big jump forward again.
So allow me to come back to the carbon markets part, the first thing that you said for a moment. Can you sort of explain to a relatively expert but nevertheless lay audience what that particular, what would success look like if we got that over the line? What would then happen in the world for the next 12, 24, 36 months that would assist our pathway towards net zero?
Okay, so I'm not describing the UK negotiating position here, but more broadly, when we look at the fact that we need to be able to invest, or the investment flows into emerging markets and developing economies for infrastructure are nowhere near the order of magnitude that we need, and countries need to be able to protect their nature and be able to value it. Most emerging markets and developing economies would like to see new revenue streams and new investments in their ability to do that. And for them, the carbon markets is one important tool. Now, that carbon market or carbon markets need to be priced effectively so that they have the desired effect, which is to reduce pollution in one part of the world and be able to generate revenue to invest in nature or in carbon removals in another part of the world. So that's really important. They have to be high integrity, right? So we can't have some of the malpractice of the past, or even short of malpractice, some of the sort of wishful thinking of the past. But I think the demand from emerging markets, developing economies is really loudly felt, which is, we know this isn't going to come from public development assistance. We know it's not going to come automatically from private sector investment. We need to open up new revenue streams that are necessary. So some of the big numbers, that were mentioned in the run-up to Glasgow and things like that, I mean, those are a long way away. I think what's more important is, can we build purposeful mechanisms that allow us to transfer resources to those who need it, and have a way of developing that from companies that are in transition. So if we look at the other side of the market, so that's the demand side, we are in transition. So there are, depending on which sector of the economy you're talking about, depending where in the world you are operating from, it may or may not be easy for you to go in the next step of transition. And so, within boundaries, and I mean, this would ideally also be more regulated by different countries, what can you as a company do? So if you can improve your energy efficiency, improve this, would there be a situation then over and above that where maybe you want to access the carbon markets? I think for highly polluting, for the hard-to-abate sectors, it's very difficult to move through a transition without accessing the carbon markets with integrity in the short to medium term. So these are all things which we agreed in Paris. Then we spent a long time in the rule book negotiating, and then we've been sort of dragging our feet and having arguments about exactly how to do that. Lots of people worried on both sides of the aisle. Are markets ever effective? Can markets ever work with integrity? But I think that the center ground is, we've got to try to do this. And I'm expecting that it will be a difficult negotiation, but this is something the world is looking to Baku to do. It would then set up what the Brazilians want to do, where the Brazilians want to, at scale, find ways to invest, the savings and the cash that's sort of around in the global economy into standing tropical forests. And it's very difficult for them to come with some of the ideas that they have, some of the very ambitious ideas they have, absent us clearing up some of this discussion around carbon markets.
Can we then come to the second, the collective quantifiable goals? Again, lots of people deeply immersed and know exactly what this is, but tell us what the significance of getting this concept across the line would be, and how that would assist matters.
So the origin story of goals, financial goals for climate negotiations goes well back beyond Paris. So it goes back to the days of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Gordon Brown and people like that sitting in a small, sweaty room in Copenhagen. But in Paris, it was confirmed again, so that we had this goal of 100 billion by a certain date, annually by a certain date, which the constructive ambiguity in agreeing that, right, was that we didn't agree exactly what was in and what was out. We didn't agree who would count it and who wouldn't. So there were all kinds of bits and pieces that then really became very problematic in an atmosphere of declining trust. But it was agreed that then in 2025 we would need to have a new goal, right? So that was 100 billion, but in 2025 we would need to have go to the next stage. So that's what's on the table now. So we can't continue the same levels of constructive ambiguity, right? The scales have fallen from our eyes. So who puts money in? Who can take money out? What are the mechanisms of transfer? If it's public money, how does it leverage private money, and how do you count that? So who contributes? How much? Is every kind of contribution measured in the same way? Is the quality of the finance as important as the quantity? All of these things are on the table. And so the way to think about what's going to be negotiated, and again, not revealing the UK's position here, is that there will have to be an agreement, or there will be language on the contributor base. So in this world of 2025, as opposed to many, many years ago in Copenhagen or 9 years ago in Paris, the world has changed, and countries are contributing, and the big emitters are some of the middle-income countries and other countries. It's not just developed countries, right? So different countries have different red lines around who has to be included in that contributor base, and how are they contributing? So, are they contributing through some kind of national fund, or are they contributing through their contributions to the multilateral development banks? What counts, right? Then the quantum, and this is what the NGOs and others, many of you have spent a lot of time on, which is how big is the number. So if it was 100 billion every year up until now, then what should it be? Well, of course, this is climate finance. This is not financing climate. Financing climate is in a killer paragraph in the Paris Agreement, which says that everything that you do in your economy should try to direct economic and financial flows towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. Well, that doesn't get negotiated in a climate convention. That's in the board of the IMF, or the board of the World Bank, or the board of European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. I mean, that gets discussed in other places. So this quantum of climate finance then gets surrounded or layered by other things. Private finance that is leveraged by this core of financing. Other things that you can do in the economy to direct finance in the right direction. So how many layers? What's counted in which layer? Does any of the outer layers, does any of that count towards the quantum? So we have people saying, look, we need $1 trillion a year. And then you can't go from 100 billion to $1 trillion of public money, right? So how do you do that? And that's all being negotiated and being worked on, not just in the convention, but also in other places. There were lots of conversations in Washington 2 weeks ago with the multilateral development banks about what their contribution is going to be. So, but if we don't come to some resolution on, the quantum, who contributes, how we measure, then it makes it extremely difficult for the Brazilians to really lead the world with trust and success. And we're asking every country to develop a nationally determined contribution. For many emerging market developing economies, they're going to look, I'm going to come up with a plan, and there's no possibility of investing against that plan because you couldn't even agree the number in Baku. So again, it's about building trust, it's about building confidence, and it's about sending signals that this leveraging of finance against these goals is going to be more likely to happen than not.
So what you described in some way is a little bit part of this kind of vague, broadly understood, but not really politically well-leveraged notion of a just transition. And what you've really argued here is a way of thinking about the just transition as a way of transferring resources from those countries with resources to those countries that don't have them, looking at the relative carbon emissions historically in that group. But there's also a notion of the just transition, which is within countries, about making sure ordinary citizens, not between the wealthy north and the less powerful global majority countries or less wealthy, but also within countries where people, I think the jury is out on whether ordinary citizens think that the climate transition is working for them. And we've had a panel today on what happened last night. And it is worth saying that the largest investment, arguably, in the history of the planet in climate finance occurred in the United States. And the other guy turned around and said, you know, the economy is not working for you, and nobody really cared and voted in the other direction in politically salient numbers. So the project of defending the just transition is, I think, a precarious one, both between countries and within them. And I wonder if you just want to kind of let us know how, you've worked domestically and now you're working globally, how you think about this and how we have to resuscitate and defend this notion if we're going to succeed.
Well, I've also lived in the United States for the best part of the last 20 odd years. So what happened last night is very personal when you have two American kids. I think the challenge, right, and it's not just the challenge in the US, but in France or here or anywhere, is that you've got to feel the results of policy, whether it's climate policy or health policy or anything. So, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which was this extraordinary, extraordinarily valuable, large investment. Congress insisted that the Inflation Reduction Act go through every state. There were all kinds of, negotiations about how to make it work and all the rest of it. So the average family in any part of the country hasn't started to feel the personal sort of comfortable end of, the tax credits or the things that were designed for the charging stations haven't been built yet or just beginning to be built, the tax credits are just arriving, the people are not stupid, right? So people are like, well, I can't feel the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, so we know that there are red state governors and red state businesses that, are very excited by it, but, that consumer level impact, I don't think will be felt in the weeks and months to come because it's just coming through the system now. But the election was yesterday, so I think that's a universal truth, right? It's like you can talk about climate policy, and we can talk about climate finance, but how does it felt, right? And how is it? How is it? What does it mean in the context of your individual lives? But zooming back up to the international conversation, I think one of the big challenges for us as an international community, because it's domestic and international, is adaptation. Right, so we know that every country in the world is experiencing this sort of fast forwarding of climate impacts. Right, what we thought was going to happen in 10 years is happening now. There's an extraordinary piece of work done, to look at London's resilience. That was published over the summer. One of the very few cities in the world that's done that kind of deep work, and yet here we are, with extreme heat and extraordinary rainfall. I mean, our hearts break for our Spanish friends, right? So we are already in a world where adaptation is, you can't projectize your way out of adaptation. Adaptation for most countries is going to be, how do we, invest in the social safety nets so that people can be more resilient? How are we going to protect our health services and our education services from the changes in rainfall? What are you going to do to protect our yields and our agricultural produce and the livelihoods of farmers? So this is a universal thing. But at the moment, when you go to a COP or when you go to a meeting of the World Bank Group or wherever else, we measure adaptation finance as the incremental cost on a project of building that road to withstand 42 degrees Celsius heat for 10 days versus 55 degrees Celsius heat for 10 days, right? So maybe you have to use different tarmacadam or whatever surface you're using. Maybe you have to build the camber of the road differently so that it doesn't warp and wend, all these kinds of things. So you're going to build a road, okay, so that's just development finance or that's investment or whatever. And then the additional cost of building it to be resilient is what you count as adaptation finance. I would suggest that over the next few years, intellectually, we're going to have to get used to the fact that everything we build, the way we live, is actually about resilience and adaptation. We're not there yet in the climate discussions because there is a very real fear from especially the lowest income countries that this means that somehow one of these buckets will be taken and used for something else and that they will not get what they need.
So let me follow that for a moment. So let's assume that the world makes the intellectual leap that you want and that road construction costs now take into account both incremental costs for heat, but also how to do flood runoff. And if you're really smart, you can do a little irrigation ditch which catches the excess water and can be used to help irrigate. And we can do all of that and we get over that hurdle. It's still, in the end of the day, building a road. And we're not yet, that's just what we've been accustomed to historically. We're still building roads. We're still not doing the point that you made about making the green transition work for citizens and for people feeling that it's actually going to reduce their energy costs or make their homes warmer or clean their air or make their food supply chains more resilient. And so creating the link in development finance between financing the incremental costs and simultaneously allocating that finance in a way that it works for ordinary citizens, that make them buy into and see the benefits of it, is a further challenge on top of that as well.
Agreed. So let's go back. So you talked about 1994. So when Trevor Manuel, right, was the finance minister of South Africa, he would say, right, development, that's my business. Right, international community, it's my business. How we develop, who we develop, at what speed, in what way, that's my business. And I think that one of the problems that we have is that you talk to any finance minister, you talk to any government of an emerging market developing economy, what do they want? They want trade and investment on reasonable terms, at decent prices. We want them to have that too, but we're working in a development industry or working in the climate finance industry or whatever, and we're using different terms. But if you're a farmer in northwest Zambia and you're growing tomatoes and you're 10 miles from the border with Congo and that's your biggest market, and you can't get it over, you can't easily get it into Congo because the customs post isn't there, because the rules aren't set up, because the road isn't very good, because you've got nowhere to store the tomatoes overnight, and so they start to, that's actually trade and investment and development and climate resilience. It's all wrapped up. So we've had a tendency in climate negotiations over many, many years. We've got 1,000 little tiny funds, right? We've got every government comes with a new initiative with a new acronym, and we slice and dice and slice and dice and slice and dice. And what's happened over the last few years is that the voice of emerging market and developing economy governments, led by Mia Mottley in Barbados, but not only others, is change the rules of the big game. Right? Don't come in with a new initiative here, a new initiative. Work with us to change these rules, because if we change these rules, then we can take care of our own business, right? So I think we are at a tipping point in the way in which we've approached development, in the way in which we've approached finance. And these countries that are in a situation where they're being pushed back into poverty by climate impacts, by extreme weather events, where the cost of borrowing is so high, where there's more money leaving the Caribbean in debt service than there is going into the Caribbean in climate funds and debt for nature swaps and all the rest of it. That's the world that we have to work on, as well as working on, the Adaptation Fund or negotiating an NCQG.
Wow. Okay, I want to ask you a question related to technology and the UK's competitive advantage in a place which has, there's, if you just walk around Covent Garden within broad proximity of the conduit, there's 50 climate tech funds being set up and loads of incredible entrepreneurs, and the UK has staked itself out as a global leader in this space and wants to leverage that for its own citizens so that it can produce wealth. But there is a question of how that the UK can use its role in the world to actually assist the global majority countries with that technology, and what role that technology can play in helping them leapfrog both to a position of greater resilience, but also to a place where their economies can grow. How do you see your role in facilitating that?
So I work for the Foreign Secretary and for the Secretary of State for Energy, right? So I've got two bosses who agree, which makes things easier. They had a long time in opposition to get to agreement. But I think what's important is, and if you listen to the Secretary of State for Energy Security, so you will have heard him flip on its head sort of the narrative that we heard from the previous government. So the previous government, in decrying net zero, basically said, look, we're the UK, we only account for 1% of emissions, so we're not the problem. Why are we forcing ourselves through this green revolution? And it's costing us money, and why are we bothered with this? So what Ed Miliband talks about is, we're only a small sliver of the pie when it comes to emissions, and precisely because of that, we have to engage the world, because there's no scenario where we do well and British people become more secure and become more prosperous and get the things that they need and become safer if we're not helping the rest of the world manage its emissions down and become more resilient. So the logic is very clear. So my very, very small part of this, externally facing, and I have a twin, Ruth Davis, who is the Special Representative for Nature. Our roles are to help ministers engage the world, and there's two pieces of this. One is listening to what the world wants and how it wants it, but also I think helping connect the dots so that the whole of the UK is more than the sum of the parts. So we've got this vibrant entrepreneurial culture here, and lots of extraordinary businesses at different stages of development. We've made commitments about financing the energy transition domestically. We've got an UK investment bank. We have the British investment BII. We have the Private Infrastructure Development Group. We have our public overseas development assistance. We have a voice and vote on every multilateral development bank, every multilateral climate fund. In fact, we're the biggest shareholders in some of those funds, and we have voice and vote on the board of the IMF. If we pull all of that together behind a theory of change, which is that we have to invest and deploy the technology necessary for the energy transition sooner rather than later, and that the UK can turn up and be consistent and say what needs to be done and do what needs to be done and use our very, very precious resources in the most catalytic way, then we could lead by example and be part of a vanguard group of countries that are committed to net zero and are on the line or above the line. And I think you'll see and hear the Secretary of State talking about that. You'll hear the Prime Minister talking about that in Baku. And I think that's the aspiration. So linking the international very much to the domestic, attracting inward investment, which is a very big focus for Number 10, but also then showing how we can stand side by side with others help. And I think we're very interested in zeroing in on where the blockages are and sort of working on the things which are stopping finance from flowing, stopping technology from being deployed.
I'd love to ask you the question about I have 3 children, also US citizens, so I'm also digesting last night.
Mine want to emigrate now.
So the UK is no longer part of the EU, has had historically a special relationship with the US, has the Commonwealth and the flip side of that, empire, and is this sort of country which is like to think of itself as having an ability to punch above its weight in diplomatic terms. It's probably fair to say it's not the scenario and you're the counterparties you would have wanted to have across the pond, but that's what you've been dealt. How do you see engaging with the Trump administration in the next couple years, and what kind of role can the UK play in either ameliorating the damage or bringing them along in ways that are helpful or strategic?
Well, it's early days, right? So I think number 10, the Prime Minister came out this morning and congratulated President-elect Trump on the victory, and itemised the issues where we would expect to deepen the relationship over the next few years. You know, issues of investment in clean tech and technology and engaging in the world multilaterally. So I think that was the statement. I think now, but I think it's also true, actually almost irrespective of what happened overnight, there are big international expectations of this government because it was a government that ran unashamedly on a net zero platform and got elected. And so, you know, believes it has a mandate and believes that this is what the British people voted for. So I think internationally, even before last night, there's a number of, you know, countries, organisations, sort of processes where the UK's leadership is being looked to. And I was just with the Secretary of State and the Foreign Secretary at an event hosted by His Majesty this afternoon on sustainability and investing. And, you know, a big part of leadership is about showing up. A big part of leadership is showing up, and, you know, and at times showing up and, you know, giving confidence and forward momentum at a time when perhaps other people are sort of a little unsure about which direction to go in and how fast to move, right? So I think we understand that very importantly, and let's see what the next few weeks hold in terms of how that conversation will develop. So we've got a COP starting on the weekend. There's a very important G20 being hosted by the Brazilians also in the next couple of weeks. And so this will all start to unfold.
We are already over time, so I'm going to invite 2 questions from the audience and from a sea of about 100 hands. But I'd love to give you a chance to ask Rachel Kyte questions that you may have.
Thank you. Sarah Goodenough, Climate Policy Radar. You're one of many speakers today who have discussed the importance of citizens feeling the impact of policy. But with short political cycles at odds with change that will require decades, how should politicians balance this without falling prey to less effective and short-term policy measures?
No, so yeah, the shortening of the political cycle, but it's also the political cycle and the sort of instant gratification of social media, right? So I mean, it's brutal, which means that political leadership is about, a large part of it is about communication, and I think that it's impossible to bring about systems change without a certain amount of bravery and courage, because you have to play the long game and then try to be good at the short game as well. But the short game on its own won't be enough. And so this maybe with my professorial hat on and my special representative hat on, when you talk about leadership, you really can instill a little bit of sort of steel in leaders. And I don't underestimate the importance of leaders talking to each other as well. So, and that could be at city level, it could be at national level. And I just hosted recently Todd Stern at Oxford, because he's written a book on the Paris Agreement. And we talked in that conversation with students about the fact that certain leaders will, in the moment, really lean in and almost expand the space. So in the case of the Paris Agreement, we were talking about Isabella Teixeira, who was the Minister of Environment in Brazil. And the High Ambition Coalition had been started. You got Tony de Bruyn, and then the US said, no, we're in, and all this sort of stuff. And it was growing and growing, but Brazil, and she just sort of took Brazil into that High Ambition Coalition. She had no instruction from Brasilia to do that, right? But it was the right thing to do, and it changed the space. And so I give that as an example of just the courage that it actually takes sometimes, and like, what's the worst that could happen? But there's a reason why I'm a special representative and not an elected member of parliament. So.
This is the most restrained and constrained answer you're going to get. Another question. Oh, yeah. We send the mic because we want to.
Because I heard that you were Octavia from the NME, but that's not right?
Hi, I am Lavinia from DNV.
See, close.
We have some of our team going and attending COP next week, and I was wondering what kind of conversations you would like them to open up in the green zone.
Well, I mean, is there good coffee? Where's the good coffee? I think in the green zone, from my recollection of a COP, the person who knows which stand has the good coffee is quids ahead, okay. But more seriously, I think, look, there's two things, right? One is we've got to get the next stage of agreements over the line, right? So we've got to hold to account parties to the convention, for parties to Paris to do that. But I think that there is also some very interesting discussions around. So much of this happens outside the COP now. It's about the performance of individual companies or sectors. It's about the performance of the multilateral development banks. It's all of it. But there's no accountability mechanism for any of their sort of hitting their numbers or their performance into the convention, right? So the convention is only holding parties to account and doing so in a fairly fragile way. So I think it's not only the conversations around all the other parts of society and the economy and what they should be doing, it's also how do they want to be held accountable. And I think there's this next generation of NDCs, they're supposed to be investment plans, they're supposed to be everything to everybody. How does that happen? So I'll stop there, but if you can tell me where you found the good coffee, we'll be friends forever.
Rachel Kyte, thank you very, very much for your time, and especially from rushing over from the palace and arriving 10 seconds before you were due to be on the stage, which was just masterful. I wish you all the luck at COP, and I think the country's lucky to have you in that position, so thank you.
Thank you.